Well, thank you very much for that warm welcome, that kind introduction, Justice. I appreciate it. First of all, I just want to say how delighted and honored I am to be here at the Turnaround Management Association. I did not know much about this organization before you invited me to speak, but I've read a great deal about it, and you do some really terrific work that's obviously vital services for our economy, and it's quite a global organization. You're quite a distinguished group of professionals. Frank took my line on accountants, so let me use another one, which I notice in the hall there's all kinds of, not just accountants, there are bankers, there are lawyers, and of course I'm an ex-politician. I'll quote my colleague and friend, the late Jim Prentice, who said his professional career consisted of being a lawyer, a politician, and then a banker, at least one of which was an honorable profession. I want to take, well, actually more than a few minutes to give you some thoughts on the world today, and then we'll get into some questions. Maybe I'll just comment very briefly on what I'm up to since I left Parliament, which is now only about 3 months. At the end of a political career that you had described, the most circuitous route to the office of Prime Minister in Canadian history, I ended a 3-decade-old political career that I spent the last decade, I like to tell I spent the last decade being having the best job in the best country in the world, for which I will be forever grateful to the Canadian population. Somebody asked me earlier tonight, they said, what do you miss most about being Prime Minister? What do you miss most about being in the media and in the news every single day? And I said, there's no doubt about it, it's the adulation. I'd always promised my wife that when my political career ended, or when it was clear it was at the end, I was not going to spend the rest of my life trying to regain past glory or settle scores or build a legacy. We would move on, have another life, and I'm doing something different than the typical just sitting on boards that often former prime ministers do, because I think I'm too young and energetic to do just that. So I have set up this global consulting firm trying to use the knowledge, experience, and network that I gained in office as a G7 leader over a period of 10 years to really help Canadian business when they're crossing boundaries. And by crossing boundaries, I mean crossing boundaries into other countries or crossing boundaries into areas that they are unfamiliar with, political environments, public institutions, things, frankly, in most countries that you absolutely have to do business. We will help clients open doors with foreign decision makers. We will help them develop partnerships with foreign partners. We will help them understand foreign markets, and we will help them understand big geopolitical trends. And that's really what I want to talk about. What are the big trends today? When I gave some thought to that, the first thing that came to my mind was a conversation I had in 2008 with Lech Walesa, the former president of Poland and the founder of the Solidarity Labor Movement, which most of you, I think most of you, not all of you, are old enough to remember, was the first step in the fall and collapse of the Soviet Union, the Soviet Empire. I asked President Walesa, when you scaled the fence of the Gdansk shipyard, August 14th, 1980, did you think you would succeed? How confident were you? Remember, this is a time where dissidents not only went to prison, they were often tortured and murdered. How confident were you of success? He told me I was very confident, and there were 3 reasons for that. One was Poland was always a Western country. He said, even the communists in Poland didn't believe in communism. So inevitably, Poland would break away from this. Secondly, we had a Polish Pope for the first time. We had this leader from outside the system, an international and national spokesperson who understood the nature of our country and its aspirations, and whom the system, the Soviets, could not silence. Third, he said, and most important, we had modern technology. He said, I was an electrician. In the 1970s, I could begin to see, with the changes that were occurring in information technology, the kinds of intricate control of communications and information used under the Soviet system were simply not going to be viable in the future, and this would undermine the system. Now, those of you who are old enough to remember know what happens next. As Solidarity and other dissident movements arose, the economy in the East Bloc continued to get poorer, continued to collapse. The willingness of Soviet authorities to impose discipline, to impose control, began to waver. First, you had the East Bloc countries break away, 1988, 89, 90. Then you had republics within the Soviet Union break away. And finally, you had Russia itself declare its independence from the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union, one of two superpowers, vanished with hardly a shot being fired. The most complete and utter collapse of a major power in the history of humanity. Monumental events. Monumental events. What I'm here to tell you tonight is the following: that those events that led to the collapse of the Soviet Union and then led to the spread of the Western economic system around the world, what we call globalization, the forces behind those things, the forces behind the collapse of the Soviet Union have not ceased. They have accelerated, and they are accelerating, and they are eroding power everywhere in the world. Another conversation. One of the advantages of being Prime Minister is you get to know pretty well anyone you want to know. So I got to know Dr. Henry Kissinger, former U.S. Secretary of State. He's 93 years old, brilliant man, still writing brilliant books, his last one called World Order. And he and I had a conversation when I left office. He asked me, he said, "Prime Minister, as you leave office, what do you see happening in the world?" I told him, I think the world is a more dangerous, chaotic, and worse place than it has been in any time in my lifetime. Now, I said, "You're older and wiser than me. What do you think?" He said, "You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right." Because, ladies and gentlemen, contrary to the title of Dr. Kissinger's book, what we are increasingly seeing in the world today is world disorder. Back to the forces that Lech Walesa identified as unraveling the Soviet Union. A rejuvenation of nationalism. Second, leadership coming from unexpected places completely outside of the political system. And third, and most importantly, the technological revolution. Let me focus on the last one. We have gone in a short period of time from the mainframe computer, back when, this wasn't in the introduction, back when I was a computer programmer. Very few people know I was once a computer programmer. It's all part of not having the charisma to be an accountant. I was programming on mainframe computers, then I was programming on personal computers when they came along. Then we went from the mainframe to the personal computer to the internet, which is the computer of computers, and now to the smartphone. So now we have something that doesn't cost very much, that almost everyone in the world of even fairly limited means can afford. And what does it mean? It means that virtually everybody in the world, soon everybody in the world, will be able to have in their hand something that gives them access to all the information they could ever want, to vast quantities of information tailored to their needs, tailored to their interests, to their needs, to their preferences, and to their biases. What does this mean? One, they have that. Two, they can transmit it. When we were younger, at least some of us, when we were younger and the television was on and we get mad, we could yell at the television, but we couldn't transmit through it. People can now transmit to everybody else. And as a consequence of being able to transmit, they can network together with whoever they want to network with. So you have, for the first time in human history, we are going to have a situation where virtually everyone in the world is politicized. And more importantly, they are politicized on their own terms, on any geographic or non-geographic basis they choose, outside of established institutions, outside of established channels of communication. And in this process, doing so increasingly creating political environments that are less political and that, frankly, environments where power is eroding. Power is eroding, including the state power, which is the basis on which this planet has been organized for several hundred years. The most extreme manifestation of this today is in the Islamic world, in that Islamic and partly Arab world, but that arc that goes all the way from the Rock of Gibraltar, all of northern Africa, through the Middle East, all the way to the Indian subcontinent. What we have happening in that area is you have a number of people, large number of people, being politicized to a particular political vision of Islam. Now, we can debate whether it is the true Islam or it is not the true Islam, but it is nevertheless a vision to which a significant number of people are being drawn and being politicized. This is a vision of Islam that rejects the legitimacy of every single state that exists in the world today. And that vision is in that part of the world undermining and overthrowing governments in places where governments were already weak, dysfunctional, and in many cases corrupt. And it is replacing them not with government as we know it, but with an increasing number in that broad arc of what we call ungoverned spaces, where there is no government in the conventional sense, where government is nothing more than bands of people who have guns and cell phones. That's one extreme. The other extreme, what I would call authoritarian Asian models, the Chinese being the most visible, biggest, but not the only example. What they're trying to do with technology is figure out how can we harness technology to continue to increase our growth and our economic capacities, while also making sure that we limit the use of technology for political purposes, for political expression, or in ways that undermine social and cultural norms. And so far, they seem to be having some success with that. But I ask you, as wealth of people continues to grow there, as they become affluent, will they continue to accept that kind of control? Or will they demand more of the political rights and individual empowerment that we in the West have come to expect? Which leads me to talk primarily about us and what is happening in our society and how all these trends relate to Western democracies. Everywhere I've gone in the past year, everywhere in the world, people ask me about two things, invariably. They ask me about what do I think of Brexit and what do I think about Donald Trump. There are some important differences among these two things, but it's the similarities that matter. And here is the big similarity that should matter the most. Hardly anyone expected either to be successful. In fact, not just didn't expect them to be successful, they were condemned by virtually all conventional commentators and condemned by virtually all the experts. And yet, they happened anyway. So what is the first big lesson? First insight we should draw from the success of the Brexit referendum, of the vote for Brexit, and of the election of Mr. Trump. And for that matter, other broad movements that share some of these similarities. There are all kinds in different parts of the world, not today in Canada, for reasons I won't get into. But it is this. The first and biggest lesson is this. Just because there is a wide consensus among all established institutions and expert voices for a particular course of action does not mean the public is going to accept that judgment in whole or in part. Why? Why? Because in our Western society today, there has, in the post-Cold War period, been a consensus developed in all major institutions. Banks, financial institutions, corporations, governments, major bureaucracies, major media and entertainment voices, a consensus around the desirability of globalization, the desirability of open borders, and in particular, freer trade and more open migration. But at the same time, we have to be frank about this, at the same time that this consensus has developed and been enacted over a period now of almost 3 decades. The reality is that for a large part of the working population, large part of the working and middle class, incomes have been stagnant or declining. Canada has been an exception. Jobs in traditional sectors have been lost by the tens of millions. In the United States, in the last 3 decades, 40% of all manufacturing jobs have disappeared. Some trade relationships have become brutally unbalanced. We talk about the desirability of freer trade. The United States trade with China is unbalanced to the level of 4 to 1. 4 to 1. Social security systems have become more insecure. And so we are having a major political cleavage developing across the Western world between, on the one hand, established institutions, those people who identify with them, who support them, for lack of a better term, the elite, people who believe in open borders because we, I think most of us in this room, literally or figuratively cross these borders quite regularly, on the one hand. And on the other hand, people, for lack of a better term, that they're calling in political discourse these days populists. The people who live within the borders. The people who live in the regions where we fly over. The people whose concerns, economic concerns, are largely, almost exclusively local in nature, not global. Peoples whose identities are national and cultural, not international and not multicultural. People whom the elite, when they disagree with them, call wrong, uninformed, and prejudiced. And I have to tell you something. Whether you believe that's true or not, my experience has been that's not a really good way to persuade people of your side of an argument. You know, there's a golden rule in politics. Someone taught me a long time ago. It is the following. When we talk about the rejection of elite opinion, in politics, nobody cares what you know or what you think you know until they know that you care. And when you tell people a message that you effectively don't care about them, that you don't share their concerns, that you don't understand their perspective, that you don't live the same realities as they do not care whether you proclaim yourself an expert. In fact, they are more likely to vote against you than for you on the basis of what you are telling them. So we have, as I say, not surprising at all if you look at the facts, we have a major challenge to some of the basic premise of government policy throughout the Western world, a rejection of elite so-called expert opinion, and to remember that it is globalization itself that makes this possible. Because gone are the days where a major national news broadcast or all of the papers singing in unison can influence public opinion. Because if people don't agree with that opinion, they're going to turn off those channels of information and go to the information, other channels of information that they can get on the internet, through their smartphone, through their own networks. In other words, globalization itself empowers these anti-elite, anti-globalization movements. And I'm going to tell you something else. I think the trajectory of all this is that this is going to become much more of a problem in the Western world in the years to come. Both the economic performance behind all of this is going to become poorer, and that as a consequence, this political gap is likely to widen and become more difficult. There's a number of reasons for this. There's basic economic forces in marketplaces and in technology, but the one I do want to make particular note of is the following, because I feel very strongly about this. The macroeconomic policies being pursued by virtually every Western government are going to make this worse. Those macroeconomic policies, so-called expansionary fiscal and monetary policies, are going to make things worse. Now, I'm speaking very differently than many of my economist colleagues. I always say the beauty of being an economist, unlike virtually every other organization, you don't really have to practice regularly or read anything in economics because we have no professional standards. You can be an economist forever. So, but look, the bottom line is this. What I'm going to tell you, you can choose to believe it or not, large deficits and loose money that we've had now for many years, those things do not promote growth. They do not promote growth, they will not promote growth, and they cannot promote growth. They are not growth policies. Properly understood, they are stabilization policies, which is why we used them as a Conservative government in 2008, 2009, when we desperately needed to stabilize the economy. But used on an ongoing basis, they don't produce growth, they produce stagnation. And if you don't believe me, there is a laboratory for this. It is called Japan. Japan has been on this track for 3 decades, or 2.5 decades, probably more accurately. And they have not had any growth or very little in that period, and that is the route, unfortunately, virtually every Western government is now headed down. Let me just take a few minutes to talk specifically about the U.S. election and about Mr. Trump and what it may mean for us as Canadians, because, I think we all are realistic enough to know there is nothing more important in the world for us immediately than what happens in the United States. I'll start this by telling you that a year ago, I had lunch with a friend in New York. I've never met Mr. Trump, but this particular individual is a mutual friend of Mr. Trump and myself. He told me the following. He said, "Don't believe for a second." He told me Trump was going to win. I was not a true believer. He told me Trump was going to win. He said, "Don't believe for a second that everything he's doing is all improvisation and shooting from the hip. He has a strategy." The strategy is very simple. Mr. Trump understands that 2/3 of the American population thinks their country is on the wrong track. 2/3. They are very angry about it. They are very offside with a bunch of very fundamental views of the world in both political parties. And he is going to appeal to that emotional rejection of the direction of the country without committing himself to specific courses of policy action or committing himself to as few specific courses of action as he can. And that's exactly what he has done. And so the top line is this. I say to you this. The top line is this. Without a doubt, a Trump presidency is a significant and going to be a significant source of global uncertainty for the next while. When it comes to specifics, we have very little idea of where this new administration will head. But I do think we have some broad ideas where it will head. And I'm going to tell you this, partly to challenge you. I don't think it's necessarily all bad. Regardless of the fact that Mr. Trump is often provocative and crude in his communications, he is a highly successful and bold individual who is determined to reverse unmistakable declining trends of American power and in the American economy, and he is determined to apply new thinking to do it. And under those circumstances, I'm not sure new thinking is all bad. So let me look at 4 areas, I say once again, with considerable uncertainty of where this is going, where what Mr. Trump is proposing may not be all bad. And I'm going to talk about his approach to governing, to international affairs, to trade policy, and to relations with Canada. First of all, on governing, Mr. Trump is an outsider, obviously. In fact, we have never seen an outsider like this. He is outside even most of his own party. He is outside of. But given the dysfunctionality of American politics for a quarter of a century, an outsider with a new paradigm may be exactly what the system needs. On top of that, Mr. Trump is by nature and vocation a deal maker, and he is going into a system that was designed for deal making, in a system where nobody else has been able to make deals for 25 years. So he's perfectly suited for that. He's also going to be, in my view, fortunately, this is obviously my particular partisan view, he will be making those deals with conservative Republican control of both the House and the Senate. So he'll be making deals with sensible people who are likely to moderate and constrain some of his more unorthodox policies. But there's risk in all this. Of course, when there's this much inexperience and it's this new, it's all risky. And it will be particularly risky in international affairs. But let me talk about international affairs for a second. I have watched, in my time as Prime Minister, and in the years that I was involved in politics, I have watched the United States foreign policy oscillate back and forth from at one extreme and in one moment, overarching global ambition to control and to intervene in every single problem in the world, and then to retreat completely into withering self-criticism. And I've seen this go back and forth, back and forth. Mr. Trump has been very critical of the current administration and what he perceives as a rhetoric that is, let's put it this way, not terribly nationalistic, underestimating U.S. capabilities, underestimating the United States as a country. He's determined to change that with an assertive nationalism. So that's very different than we've also had. But Mr. Trump has also said that he rejects, and he's been very clear about rejecting the foreign policy of the previous Republican administration, which he saw as overreaching, never trying to estimate its limitations. I would suggest to you this. What Mr. Trump is essentially proposing is that the United States conduct a foreign policy based on American self-interest, coldly assessed, and based on a willingness to engage with other countries on shared projects when those other countries are prepared to bring real assets to the table. I suggest to you that in the modern world where the United States simply is not as powerful as it once was, this is an entirely realistic course of action for the United States. It's entirely realistic. It also could make U.S. foreign policy a lot more predictable. But look, this is going to take us into an unknown world. We will have, for the first time in 8 decades, a situation where there are not one or two major powers trying to shape every global event. So we're into areas with tremendous risk. I could talk about what those risks are, but I'll maybe leave that till later. Now, let me just talk about his trade policy. Given my record in government, you're probably surprised to hear me say I don't think that his trade policy is necessarily all bad. And that's in spite of the fact, just to recap the record, my government concluded more trade negotiations than all previous governments in Canadian history combined. When we came to office, Canada had free trade access with only 5 countries. When I left, we had concluded negotiations with 51 countries. But that gave me a bit of an insight, because we actually did conclude negotiations, unlike so many of the people who praise trade agreements but never actually do them. What I do understand, and what I know Mr. Trump understands as a successful businessman, is not every deal is a good deal. And the reality is this, that the gross imbalances in some of America's trading relationships, whatever their cause, cannot be sustained economically or politically, and something has to be done about that. Mr. Trump is going to pursue a much tougher approach to trade policy and trade deals. It might well be possible, for instance, that in dismantling the Trans-Pacific Partnership and negotiating one-on-one with all these various countries, that he could get better trade deals for the United States. But once again, this is all very risky, going to a whole new paradigm. He's going to tackle NAFTA, right? Let me talk about that one and really relations with Canada. I want to leave you with this thought about the relationships of Mr. Trump's relationship with our country. I believe that all of the risks in that relationship are on our side of the border. First, I believe Mr. Trump is absolutely deadly serious when he says he is going to do something about North American trade and illegal migration. That said, I have watched very carefully what he said. The bad news for Canada is this. If he is serious, as he says, and decides to terminate NAFTA, if he is serious, he can do that very easily. Article 2205 in NAFTA stems out of the original Canada-U.S. trade agreement. We were the ones who insisted on the termination clause. We were the ones, Canada, who insisted on making the termination of NAFTA as easy as possible. And the termination clause for NAFTA is 6 months' notice via executive order. It does not need to go through Congress. So it is extremely easy, thanks to us, to terminate NAFTA. That's the bad news. The good news for Canada is this, that contrary to media reports, Mr. Trump has made no specific threats against Canadian trade that I am aware of. He's made all his threats specifically against Mexican trade, North American more broadly, but nothing specifically about Canada. And in fact, if Mr. Trump decided to get rid of NAFTA, he could easily, just as easily as he gets rid of NAFTA, he could retain the original Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement. So that is a real possibility. But as I say, the risks are on our side. Should we decide to work with Mr. Trump in dealing with his concerns about Mexico, we could be fine. Should we instead decide to link arms with the Mexicans to fight Mr. Trump or to bargain against Mr. Trump, we could be very badly sideswiped. This, by the way, applies to many other areas of policy. Should we decide to join international coalitions against Mr. Trump's policy on this and that, this will be very bad for us. Should we decide to act as a constructive partner, which doesn't mean always agreeing, but it means at least acting within our clear self-interest, then I think there is an opportunity for a constructive partnership, and I think that he will reciprocate. He will also do some things that are on the surface good for the Canadian economy. He is going to liberalize the American economy in ways that may well produce some growth. He is going to, in particular, end the increasing blockades or threatened blockades to Canadian energy and resource exports. He's going to approve the Keystone Pipeline, for example. All of these things could be growth and opportunity for Canada, but the risk is this. If we continue on our side of the border to erect tax, legal, and environmental impediments to our own industry, given a more competitive United States, this could be very problematic for our business. I could conclude maybe just with some general comments on what business should do in this environment, but I'll maybe leave that to just say, to just note this, that Harper and Associates has a lot of experience in these areas. I want to point out in particular that in a period, the last 10 years, where there has been growing political headwinds against trade and migration, that in Canada, we managed to sign a record number of trade agreements, and we managed to run the largest per capita immigration program in the world, and we did both without any significant public opposition. So it can be done, but there does have to be a significant understanding of how to deal with these issues and how to navigate them. Thank you once again for inviting me here, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. That was terrific.
Thank you.
Now, I'd like you to look upon this scene and see the fire going behind us. We're going to have a fireplace conversation. And so I hope it'll warm the cockles of your heart when you look at the flames behind. There have been a number of questions that have been posed by various people in this organization. Let me begin with a question about the Canadian economy and our opportunities. Where do you see Canada's biggest opportunities in the global economy?
Well, look, I'll try and answer this in a way that doesn't comment on current policy. But look, I think that the advantage that Canada has as a country is that we are an advanced industrial society with a range of capacities all the way from natural resources to the most advanced technology and services. And I think that is a tremendous strength for the Canadian economy. And what makes us particularly unusual is that we are an advanced country with vast quantities of energy and resources. And I think it is essential as a country to really exploit our advantage in the world, that we take advantage of those assets. Let me just comment generally on, let's forget about the economy for a second. Let's just comment generally on what should Canadian business do about the environment, about the global political trends I just described, political and economic trends. And I'll make these comments. They're very broad. Obviously there's different lessons for different industries or for different businesses within those industries. But a couple of things. First of all, realize that the political environments in which business will be operating in the years to come, even in the most stable countries in the world, are going to be increasingly politically volatile. That's just a fact. What do you do about that? You make sure, through the modern means of communication and technology, you have intimate, networked relationships with all the people who matter to you, with your clients, with your suppliers, with your stakeholders, with your local communities where you operate, with political actors who may intersect and bureaucratic actors who may intersect with those things. Make sure you have those networks. Make sure you are communicating with all of those people, and use those channels of communication. Do not use broad public channels of communication because they are not your friend and not likely to be helpful. Secondly, realize that we are in a developed world that is going to have, I think as a whole, could be exceptions, but I think as a whole, is going to have very little growth in the years to come. So if you want to take advantage and grow your business opportunities, that's not going to come about because there are growing markets. They're going to come about because you are a superior performer and a superior competitor.
Is 2 to 3% global growth, is that going to be the new norm for some period of time, do you think?
I think that low growth in the developed world is going to be a norm in the 0 to 1% range, maybe lower in some cases. And I think in the emerging markets, there will be significantly better opportunities for growth, but those will be radically different. I think, Frank, one of the mistakes of analysis of the past few years has been, to lump these markets together, the BRICS. Well, Brazil, Russia, India, China, these could not be different markets in terms of political environments or potential for growth.
You talk a bit about NAFTA, and you also indicated that it's what's going to happen in the U.S. It's risky and nobody really knows. Right. To abandon NAFTA, how realistic do you see that as being something that can be achieved? I understand they can give notice, but to do something has to go through Congress. And I was watching today when I was on the elliptical in the gym, I was watching a discussion by an economist, by an auto parts man, stating that the auto companies have plants in Mexico, Canada, and the U.S.
Right.
And they're not something that can just be abandoned and have the companies work in the other two countries. And as well, import tariffs are not going to help U.S. consumers. What's your prognosis as to how realistic it is that something like NAFTA can just be thrown out and not replaced with something?
Okay. As I just said, if Mr. Trump wants to repeal NAFTA, he can do so and do so easily. He can scrap NAFTA by executive decision of the President of the United States, give withdrawal notice, 6 months, and they're out. And it does not have to go through Congress. There would, in that case, be a reversion to WTO tariff schedules and the like. It is true that if he wanted to put in an entire new regime, new tariffs, etc., that would require congressional approval. That part would be more difficult, but the withdrawing part is not difficult. That would be more difficult. I'm not quite sure, in fairness, what Mr. Trump's actual ambition here is. I am reasonably confident that outside very narrow areas, he will have no complaint about Canadian-American trade. He understands that in virtually every industry, our supply chains are very tightly integrated. And there's no drumbeat in the United States to have protectionist measures against Canada. There simply aren't. Mexico is different. There are pressures to do that. Could he slap on a bunch of tariffs with congressional support on Mexico? The answer is absolutely yes. Would that cause factories to be abandoned overnight and raise costs for consumers? Answer, overnight wouldn't cause them to be abandoned. Yes, it could raise costs on consumers, but it would render pressure on car companies to gradually shift that work back to the United States, and he may well want to do that.
What about softwood lumber? Has he been making noises about looking into that?
The softwood lumber dispute is of an entirely different nature. When we concluded both the Canada-U.S. agreement and later NAFTA, softwood lumber was essentially not part of that agreement. We didn't reach agreement on softwood lumber. My government reached agreement with the Bush administration on a softwood lumber trade agreement, which unfortunately the Democrats were never very keen on and the Liberals in our country opposed. And so that agreement was allowed to lapse after the election last year. So there will, in one way or another, there will be a renegotiation, or there will be a negotiation going on the softwood lumber file. I wouldn't want to predict how that will go, but I'll make this prediction successfully. Whatever deal comes out of it, if a deal comes out of it, it will not be as good as the arrangement we had with the Bush administration, which was supported by virtually the entire industry in Canada.
Can I change the subject a bit, talk about Mr. Putin? he's been on record as supporting Donald Trump and to restore ties with the U.S. And Donald Trump has been making friendly noises with him.
Right.
Do you have any view as to whether the two of them can succeed in improving relationships between the two countries?
I tell people I had a front row seat for 10 years watching two American presidents, very different people with very different agendas, George W. Bush and Barack Obama, work sincerely and very hard to make a constructive partner out of Vladimir Putin. And they failed. And I don't believe anyone will succeed at making a constructive partner out of Vladimir Putin. Now, some of you may recall and probably would guess that I am not on Mr. Putin's Christmas card list. I tell people there are two places in the world where Harper Associates cannot do business. One is Russia, and the other is Iran. And look, I think Mr. Putin, don't get me wrong, in spite of our famous battles, and basically I urged that we throw him out of the G8 before he invaded Ukraine, and then we threw him out after. So I'm sure he blames me for that, or credits me, depending on how you look at it. As I say, I just don't. I think Mr. Putin is a man of many remarkable abilities, in fact, but I don't think he will ever be a friend, and I don't think he will ever be a partner. And I think it is unfortunate. This is my biggest single. You know, I can look at all the things about Mr. Trump, and I'm deciding to see the glass as half full, because I think there are risks. But in most things, as I just laid out, I can see the point. I could see where the direction could be positive. It's hard for me to see where another attempt to romance Vladimir Putin is positive. I just don't think it will end up as a positive thing. And I think, unfortunately, after several years, we will come back to the original situation.
In your interactions with him, we all read about what you just described. What's he like to deal with? Does he just listen and say nothing, or does he say what he thinks he wants you to hear and then go back and ignore it?
No, he is very cagey, but I wouldn't say that I ever found Mr. Putin to necessarily be well, I would say, I didn't find him to be a categorical liar. I mean, there were times, I suppose.
What do you really think?
There were times, I suppose, where he was, but it was obvious. The one lie I remember he told me was when I told him to get out of Ukraine. He told me, "Well, I'm not in Ukraine." You know, the lies he tells are kind of transparent ones. Look, he's a very smart guy. He always comes very well briefed, but he is a humorless individual who, I'm really a stand-up comic compared to Mr. Putin, who, you know, Mr. Putin has said, I mean, this is on the record, Mr. Putin has said the biggest tragedy in the 20th century was the fall of the Soviet Union. We should just be clear what he meant by that. Mr. Putin is not advocating communism. He actually rejects communism. But he believes that what should have happened is the Soviet Union should have abandoned communism, but not abandoned its status as a great empire. It should have switched its economic system and continued to be a great empire and a rival for world power with the United States and Europe and China and everybody else. And that is what he is intent on doing, on being a rival for global power. And nothing will change. Nothing will change that nature of his character.
Let me ask you about Brexit. What's your view as to what drove the Brexit vote the way it did in the UK?
Well, look, I have a bit of a different take on that. I think the biggest thing that drove the vote was that down deep, the British people want Brexit, meaning that I think down deep, the British people have wanted what they have always wanted, what they have told they were getting in the 1970s when they joined the European Union. They wanted deep economic integration with Europe, but they did not want political union. They didn't want legal union. They didn't want to share social policies. They wanted, and I said this, I don't mind telling you, I said this before, just as the referendum began in Britain. I had a conversation with David Cameron, who remains a very good friend and was a great partner of Canada. And I warned David, I thought, you know, this thing has a good chance of passing. And he said, why? And I said just what I just said, because I think down deep, your people want deep economic union with Britain, but they do not want political union or legal union or anything else. And he said, well, I just don't see how that's possible. You know, I know from Canada, you have your trade deal now with Europe and you think it's possible. I said, I'm not talking about our trade deal with Europe. I'm talking about Canada's relationship with the United States. We have deep economic integration. I suspect many of us in this room would like to see that integration be deeper, make it easier to cross the border economically. But how many people in Canada would want us to pursue political, legal, or social union with the United States? And I think this is what the British people always wanted. Then I think there were specific things that happened, obviously the migration crisis in Europe and other things, that drove, in a much stronger sense, this desire of people to make their own decisions, to be able to have control over their borders, control over their future trade agreements. The people voting for overwhelmingly, you know, be very careful of everything you read. I tell people, be careful of everything you read and see in the conventional media. You know, all of the people who told you Brexit would never happen are now telling you why it happened. Well, they were wrong about whether it could happen, and they're wrong about why it happened. For instance, you will read the Brexit vote, like some of the vote for Trump, is a big vote for protectionism. The vast majority of people who voted for Brexit in Britain are on the center right, and they are for trade. They are for trade. They actually voted against the trade restrictions they see the European Union applying. So this is a complete mischaracterization. But, you know, as I say, this is the path they want. Look, just a quick comment. I think it is possible that the British could end up in a much better situation in the long term being outside the European Union. But there is no beating around the fact that to get from here to there, the short-term cost will be very significant. The adjustment cost will be significant.
Do you see a whole bunch of different agreements between Britain and the various European countries?
No. No, the nature of the European Union is you're going to have one trade, one agreement with Europe. Yeah, and it's not going to be easy. You know, that's not going to be easy to do. I know the British want to negotiate a new trade agreement with Europe, and they want to do it before they leave the European Union. But they may well find, if they're committed to staying on that course, and I think the public will hold them on that course, that they may have to leave the European Union before they actually get a trade deal with Europe.
So it would be huge dislocation for some period of time.
Significant.
You mentioned the immigration issue. Obviously, there arose towards the end of the Brexit vote, and that people have different views about the ethnicity and what effect that had.
Right.
People have views in the U.S. election about ethnicity and what that effect had. In Canada, we haven't seemed to run into that problem very much. Do you have any views on why that would be?
Yeah, I do. And, you know, we say it's because the official reason we give, and it's not an invalid reason, we say because we like to think of ourselves as more tolerant. The fact of the matter is that from the outset, Canada has never been a country with a monolithic culture. Right from the beginning, we had 2 major language groups and 2 major religions and a bunch of other minorities. So we never had a kind of a clear ethnic view of what was a Canadian, and we've had successful policies of multicultural immigration and integration over a long period of time. But I think there's something else that we don't talk about. It's that we make our own immigration policy decisions. They are not made for us. They are not made by a faraway government in Brussels deciding who can and can't come. And they are not, or who comes even if we tell them we don't want them to come. And they're not made by millions of people entering the country illegally and just deciding they're going to be immigrants. And it is my view, and I've warned foreign leaders who've said, we want to replicate the political culture you have in Canada. I've told British and American and other leaders, if Canadians had no say over who was coming into our country, immigration would not be popular. And I think this is a huge problem that has to be fixed. On this, you know, Mr. Trump is crude and wrong on some of the things he says about immigration. But some of the sentiments he's appealing to are perfectly valid, and reasonable policymakers and reasonable analysts are going to have to tackle those concerns rightly. And let me tell you what they are. They are, first of all, that immigration has to be a decision made by the country accepting immigrants, not by immigrants just arriving illegally. Secondly, we must accept that most of the public is going to believe for the foreseeable future that the rights of citizens are greater and the obligations of governments are greater to their own citizens than they are to people who are outside the country. They're going to have to accept the fact that in an age of global jihad, people are seriously concerned about the impacts of certain types of immigration on potential security. They're going to have to accept that there are real concerns in some parts of the community, particularly in lower income areas, about some of the integration and other difficulties that often arise with immigrants. These are real problems in some parts of Europe in particular. We're going to have to come to terms with the fact that in a time where working class people's incomes have not just been stagnating but falling, people are really concerned about the labor market impacts of low-skilled immigration. And these, I put to you, these can be expressed by people who may well be prejudiced and whatever, but that does not make them invalid concerns in and of themselves. And unless we address them, they will grow. One of the reasons, I think, as a Conservative government, we were the first government in history in Canada that did not cut immigration during a recession. We did not cut immigration during the great crisis of 08, 09, and what followed after. We welcomed immigrants, but we reformed the program to try and make sure that the immigrants we were picking were of maximum value to the Canadian economy. We took measures to deal with unscrupulous immigration consultants, to deal with some aspects of the small illegal immigration stream that we have. We did some things to deal with those things. So part of the reason we kept people on side was not just that we were pro-immigrant, but we were anti-immigration abuse. And if every time the public sees a politician saying we got to do immigration abuse and they're accused of being a racist, the public is getting pretty sick of this in the United States and Britain. The public isn't going to change its mind on this.
No. Changing it a bit, you were talking about in your youth working as a programmer, and in fact I had read that, but I didn't think I'd get into too much detail.
You did anyway. So.
In the U.S., in this election, well, it's been going on now for 2 or 3 elections, ever since the advent of some television stations other than the 3 majors. When I grew up, there was ABC, NBC, and CBS, and that was it.
Right.
Then along came CNN, sometime, I guess, in the early 80s. And now, every television station purports to be telling the public what the reality is, and they're all different, and they're all, it seems to be extreme. Do you see that as being a cause of the dissension in the U.S.?
Yeah, as I say, people can get their own information, and they can seek it from sources that they trust. There was a day, as you say, there were, take the United States, there were 3 major broadcasts, and there were, numbers of papers who, to be blunt, all pretty much had the same take on what was news and what the appropriate opinion about that news would be. And now people don't have to accept that that's the case. They can go to other news sources that give them things they care more about and a different perspective. And look, there are some terrible news sites out there, and there's fake news, and there's risks, and there's extreme blogs and everything else. I guess I'm a bit prejudiced on this. I happen to think as a conservative, since I find almost all of the traditional media takes a viewpoint on everything different than mine, I'm glad there are other viewpoints. I think that's a positive thing. But look, you're not going to recreate the world. And I know this frustrates many journalists, that they can't kind of recreate the world where this is the real news and this is the correct opinion to have about it. Those days are over. Those days are over. And until there's media that's tailoring its message for these differentiated markets, all conventional media is going to continue to decline. It is in rapid decline. Some of it is in clearly terminal decline. Virtually all conventional media is in desperate short-term or long-term financial trouble. And that is going to continue until they figure out a way of adapting to the new environment.
Okay. All right, I've got a few softball questions I've been asked to ask. What are the accomplishments that you're most proud of for your government in the 10 years that you led it?
Look, I could point to a number of things. I think the one that people will remember the most is the conclusion of all the trade agreements. Now, obviously, CETA just is kind of finally getting ratified, and TPP may never get ratified. But we had concluded a series of agreements which gave us, as a country, free trade, tariff-free, and beyond tariff-free access to all the major markets of the world, of the developed world, to Europe, to North America, and to Asia. We were going to be the one developed country with that kind of incomparable access. So I think that was an achievement people will remember. I must admit, I'm proud of the fact that although we went into a deficit in the recession in 08-09, and some of it deliberately because of the circumstances, I'm proud of the fact we got out of it. Because the history of deficits tends to be once you get into them, you never get out of them. They just get bigger, and they get bigger quite fast. So I'm proud of those things, and I can point to other things. My proudest moment, I have to tell you, and this is not the government per se, although we had a hand. The proudest moment I had, well, look, anytime I met our troops serving in tough environments, that's a proud moment. But my proudest moment as Prime Minister was really the 2010 Olympics in Vancouver. Who would have thought? I mean, I can remember, Nancy Green was a member of my caucus, and we all remember Nancy Green if you were alive in 1968, because she won kind of the only medal Canada won in the entire decade. I'm exaggerating a bit. But no one would have believed back then that in an Olympic Games, Canada would not only win the most gold medals at the Games, that we would win the most gold medals of any country ever at an Olympic Winter Games. So I was really proud, very proud of the young men and women who are outstanding role models. Let me just tell you another story, which is what's the most difficult and the toughest part? People say you're criticized in the news, these sorts of things. The most difficult moments as Prime Minister for me, no more difficulty, is when you had to phone the families of soldiers who were killed in action. And look, it's a mixture because these terribly sad events, but also people who are tremendously proud of the service and sacrifice of their loved ones. But those are by far the most difficult moments.
They would be. Who were the most interesting people, one or two persons you met while you were Prime Minister, here or abroad?
You meet lots of interesting people. You meet lots of very impressive people. Somebody asked me the other day, who was the most impressive foreign leader you met? Let me tell you a couple of things that would surprise you on that. George W. Bush, you would constantly read about how George W. Bush wasn't a very smart guy and wasn't a very friendly guy, etc. First of all, he's one of the friendliest, most approachable people you could ever meet. But secondly, I was never in an international meeting behind closed doors with all kinds of world leaders where George W. Bush was not the best briefed and the most articulate person in the room. Never a single time. I can, by the way, say pretty much the same thing about Barack Obama, who's also, unsurprisingly, by reputation, extremely bright and articulate individual. Angela Merkel, Chancellor of Germany, very impressive individual. I know Europe has its problems, but she has at least managed to keep it from running into the ditch on numerous occasions, just through practically her actions alone. Very impressive individual. Now, in terms of interesting, I'll tell you this and I'll tell you the whole story. I'm a big Beatles fan, as I think some of you know. And one of the most difficult things I ever did as Prime Minister was one day I got a call from Paul McCartney, and I refused to take the call. And I don't believe that has happened to Mr. McCartney since 1962, when Decca Records turned down the contract with the Beatles because, quote, guitar groups were on their way out. So I think it's a long time since Mr. McCartney had not had his phone call returned. Well, why were you, as a Beatles fan, not speak to Mr. McCartney. He was actually on the line. I said, I'm not talking to him. The reason was he was then married to the wife that ended, some of you remember that marriage ended very badly. But Mr. McCartney was calling me because he was in Canada and he was on a tirade against the seal hunt.
Against?
The seal hunt. And the Government of Canada defends the seal industry as an honorable industry pursued by a small number, but frankly a small number of reasonably non-affluent people who make their living in this occupation and have done it for centuries, both in Atlantic Canada, Newfoundland, and in the far north. And I was not going to be, no matter how much I would like to talk to Paul McCartney, I was not going to put being friends with a celebrity ahead of what I thought were the industries of ordinary, hardworking Canadian citizens. That said, several years later, in 2013, Mr. McCartney had a concert in Ottawa, and I had a ticket. And normally, one of the beauties of being Prime Minister, you go to a concert, Bob Seger or whoever it may be, they normally want to see you. They'll say, oh, is he here? Will he come and visit me? So I met all these guys, and they're wonderful people. Actually had an opportunity to play with a couple of them. I played with Randy Bachman and Fred Turner in my living room. But in terms of Paul McCartney, I said, well, they'd phoned our office to ask about something, and I said, well, look, let's do something. Let's make a request if he'll meet me. So I said, I'd like to meet Mr. McCartney, and he actually agreed to meet me. And we had a very nice meeting, and he was very charming and very warm and everything. But it was a great thrill. That was a great thrill for me, and I'm pleased he would actually meet me after I refused to take his phone call.
I wanted to ask you one last question. It has to do with the Iran-U.S. nuclear deal that Mr. Trump has said was a terrible deal. How much of a role did the Canadian government play in that deal, either under the discussions or being asked for advice? What was the role of Canada in that?
Well, I don't want to exaggerate. This was a deal negotiated between the government of Iran and what's called the P5+1, the 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, the United States, Russia, China, France, and Britain, along with Germany. So those 6 parties negotiated with the government of Iran. They did ask us our opinion. We did express our opinion, both some degree of encouragement and some degree of concern. And when the agreement was eventually announced, some of you may remember the position of the Government of Canada took is that, well, we congratulated the parties on successfully concluding a negotiation. We warned people that we were going to judge the success of this deal by the actions of the government of Iran afterwards, not by what is in the terms of the deal. And I would tell you that in all honesty, based on that criteria, in the period since the government of Iran has signed the deal, I am not impressed with the government of Iran's living up to its obligation under that agreement.
That's disappointing. You read that in the media that they have been living up to it, but I guess it's
that they have been.
That they have been, but I guess whoever wants to put that forward puts that forward.
Yeah, I think it's stretching the argument a bit to say they may have been living up in the most technical sense, but they are certainly not living up to the spirit of the agreement.
I want to thank you,
and let me just add, Justice, I don't think Iran has, in fact, surrendered its ambition to achieve a nuclear weapon and to get one.
Mm-hmm. I want to thank you, Prime Minister, for coming tonight, speaking to us, and answering all these various questions.
Thank you, everyone. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.